It's a great privilege to have Tishani Doshi with me. She's a dancer, author, uh, poet, and today we're talking to her about her new book, Egrets While War, which I think is one of the most. Here it is with my notes, and it's one of the most remarkable anti-war books anti-war collection of poems I've read in a long time. And I love all the references and the tributes that you've paid to so many people here, and we'll come to that. But Tishani, talk to me a little about why you wrote this and how you wrote this.
Yeah, thanks, Kaveree. So basically, the poems emerged coming out of COVID, thinking about the world having changed in such a radical way, this epidemic, this pandemic that we all, experienced together, and thinking as a poet, what do I want to turn my attention to? And I really had been feeling for some years that I want to go into the lyric, into love poetry, back into the singular I, into the relationship of self and world and nature and birds and all of that, which there is in the book. There is a lot of looking and observation and, relation to the natural world. But obviously, there was also this looking out into the many conflicts, the economic crisis, the planet, global warming, the anxieties around climate change, and all of these things. And so I think the poems just became ways of containing this incredible kind of a planetary grief that I think many of us feel, this sense of what does it mean to be alive now, and to be able to look at the horrors squarely in the face, but also to be able to attend to the notion of awe and beauty and the things that fill us with some kind of admiration for being alive and for the planet. So I think the poems come out of those murky territories that seem to be quite far apart from one another.
Exactly. Although it's so much about grief and war, it doesn't leave you with a sense of desolation. You know that this is happening around you, but I think that's the best part about poetry. It allows you to see the beauty of the world as well. And as you said, there's so much of the natural world in it. I wonder how much of that was also a response that you had to the pandemic, and really we were living through a time when actually nature was allowed to be, and wasn't
Yeah,
at the service
true.
of man or womankind.
Yeah, there was this possibility of a giant reset button, and I think we all know that we are very far from that and we have fallen into something of an abyss since then.
Yeah.
But I think that the feeling of resilience, or the feeling of a kind of time frame that exists much beyond our paltry human lives, is also an important thing to consider. I'm sure that many generations of people have felt, that like little, that the sky is falling, and that, when we were growing up, I'm a child of the 80s, I would say, sort of the threat of nuclear war, or the Berlin Wall. I mean, these became symbols for hope or desperation, the sense that um, we could either be this or we could be this, and I think that's always going to be there. It's a very human response to think that things are really terrible or things are really great. And I feel that at the moment, because of technology and because of this accelerated sense of speed of everything, it is really quite hard to kind of change our relationship to time, because this time feels like everything. But that's why this sort of moment in the garden of looking at the egrets and feeling their connection to dinosaurs, and slipping back into that really evolutionary soupy time, that became something really interesting for me, because we are surrounded by that sense of time as well, by these rocks, by mountains, by the natural world. And so we do have the possibility to go backwards and forwards in time if we allowed ourselves that relationship.
And I love also all the references, for instance, Keats's letters to Fanny Braun. Recently there was a fresh collection that came up. Apparently, some of the letters were stolen, and they've now come.
Yeah.
They've been recovered again, and I was reading them, and they are so profound, and so immediate in this need to love and to convey the love. And I love that, that phrase you use, I'm greedy of you,
Yeah.
that I hope love will eventually save us. We think it will, but
Yeah.
I hope it will.
I mean, that line, I love that line when I read
I
it because
love
it's,
that.
I'm greedy of you, not for you,
Yeah.
the
Of
use of the
you.
word
Yeah.
of you. And I think that that kind of, that is very much part of the collection, that greediness almost of insistence upon the matters of the heart, of this kind of middle age, which is where I am in life, but this kind of feeling of wandering, like Dante said, in the middle of your life, and you're kind of looking back, and there is childhood with its own time zones, speaking of time, and there is the future, which feels increasingly despairing and threatened. And so I feel that the body, obviously for me as a dancer also, that physicality of the body and that importance of its, if its capabilities, and it's, whether it's lust or love or anger or rage or beauty, all of this is held very physically in the container body. And so I feel like, yeah, there are these poems as well which kind of insist upon this nectaring, this joy, this being here, however fraught it is.
And some of the poems seem so personal to me. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but the one that's dedicated to Giselle Piccolo, you talked about the body. Talk a little about that poem. It's a very powerful poem. Talk a little about.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that what's been happening, as somebody who's been writing about, this experience of being a woman, of femininity, of the female principle through dance, through working with Chandralekha to being a feminist and writing these things. I think what's been very interesting is to see how this Giselle Pellico case had arrived at a moment when the sort of Me Too has been faltering and flailing, and this kind of renewal of shifting the shame back. I was really struck by the story, like many women, I'm sure. I heard her at the Hay Festival live. That place was packed with 1,700 people listening to her. And there is something to be said, and she was talking about how she found love again after all of this, which was just remarkable, speaking of love.
Amazing. Yeah.
When you know the details of that story. And I feel that poetry is a way where you can go back to questions of memory, you can go to collective things, you can go to your own singular experiences. But it is not the same as memoir, it is not the same as writing a piece of journalism, or there is some shift whereby you are able to transform something in a very powerful way, and you're dealing with a very different level of what is truth. And I think that for me, I've always been really interested in those boundaries, and what language can do, and how it can be negotiated to kind of go back into the past to speak to another time. And so for me, that poem was really about going back to my own teenage self and having a kind of reckoning with her, I suppose, in some way.
I mean, a kind of reclamation of who you were, or a sort of a closing of that chapter. How would you describe that?
I think this feeling, for me, of the way that I think of memory, this book is full of ancestors. It's full of, grandmothers and great grandmothers and grandfathers and people who I never met, but who exist in some kind of way in my imagination. And included in that are also my younger selves, because they feel so far away from who I am now today. And yet I wouldn't be who I am if not for all those people and my earlier selves. And so it's not a question. I think you're never done with things. I think you're never done with things. They're with you always. You're never done with grief or any of those sort of big experiences that, mark you. But I think it's a question of sort of not not shying away from it, or just going back to being brave enough to re-enter or to go back into the past and say, let me look at this again, and let me, not judge too harshly my own self in this. So I think, yeah, I think there's a little bit of that, particularly in that poem. But in general, I feel that childhood, whether it's, cleaning sticks, the teeth with the neem twigs with my cousins, or, whether it's sitting and eating mangoes on the kitchen floor of my grandparents' house in Madras, and, like I use the word vegetarian brutes, sucking the sun gold flesh. There are these moments, and it's very interesting how poetry can, through the use of the image, create this kind of snapshot feeling of, spiraling you into somebody else's life or photo album in a way, and putting an emotion into it.
Especially the childhood and studio scene, that is really like it's like watching a series of photographs, it's
Yeah.
so visually rich. I
Yes.
feel that
And
you're there.
yeah, and that actually was inspired by an artwork by Ella Eunice, and she creates these kind of small little, like she was on these film sets, and so it's a totally different sort of relationship to growing up in India as I was, but looking at these little architectural film sets in Greece and whatnot, which were sort of reproducing these Arab soap operas and TV shows, and about her own childhood memories, I was able to put my childhood memories while looking at these little sculptures. And so I was thinking about, I chose three moments. So one is Rajnikant, who was, my
Yeah,
upstairs neighbor, were
I
film
love
producers,
that.
and that, getting kissed on the cheek by Rajnikant when I was 3 years old is like, we have just memorialized that in the little vignette. And, Indira Gandhi's assassination, it's sort of a very, very powerful, potent memory, even all the way down south in Madras. It's obviously nothing like people who are in Delhi, but there was this sense of a huge shift, an earthquake happening. And so I think those memories are really interesting to me, on how they connect personal to a larger collective.
And talking about courage, which you talked about earlier, you have a poem dedicated to Muhammad Al-Burai. Talk a little about that.
Yeah, that poem, actually, that was a commissioned poem, and it was Red Cross who asked me, the International Red Cross, to write about, their migration campaign. And I said, look, I'd really like to speak to somebody about their experiences, because it's too much for me to intervene with an imagined story. I would rather speak to someone. So I spoke to Muhammad, who had made his way from Gaza to Slovenia, to Ljubljana, and we spoke on October 6th, 2023. We spoke the day before our world has so significantly changed,
Yeah,
and in that conversation, we were supposed to have a series of conversations, but it turned out only to be one, because then, he was
okay, to stay.
completely, I mean, he was just his he was okay with his family, but his whole life was in Gaza. And there was this sense of, so we had this hour and a half conversation, and through that the poem came about. And it was really just from the geography of how he left, where he went, how people had treated him, what people said, and again mixed with, you know my own things, which are the mountains look like hands, etc. So I think that there was this back and forth that happened, and that poem very much was thinking about this question of, migration, of leaving, of what one leaves behind, and how you begin your life in a new place, and then how all of that is completely and utterly changed when something like October 7th happens.
Absolutely. You've also dedicated some of the poems to one of them to Sergei Yesenin and to John Burnside. Talk a little about them as well. They're both are they poets who who sort of left a mark on your life, on your work?
Yeah. So the Burnside poem, yes, is dedicated in memory of John Burnside, who was just a really important sort of a totemic poet for me, a writer, because he was not just a poet. He also wrote fiction, he wrote nonfiction, he wrote essays, he wrote criticism. He was a beautiful writer with an incredible imagination and just a poet of liminality. He was always writing about these thresholds and these in between spaces. And I really was so interested in his work, and it continues to be very important to me. And the Sergei Yesenin, that is a poem that's written after him. The title is taken from him. I am the last poet of the village, and I love that title. I love that sense of there's something very heartbreaking, and I guess this notion of the endling, the notion of vanishing is very of extinction, of species extinction, of just disappearance is very strong in this collection. So not just with the birds, not just with like the dodo or the all of these birds who we don't know what they sounded like, and they're lost to us forever, but just this sense of this end times feeling, this sort of apocalyptic feeling that I think we are all, even just this summer, the hottest this, the craziest fires, the this, the that. We are living in a moment where we are constantly being made to look at the environment and understand that, we have brought ourselves to this point, and everything that has passed, we may not regain that. And so I think that little poem is really an anthem, a kind of plea, or wanting us to believe in that we were these beautiful people who, wove baskets for fish and who made
Yeah.
these deer tooth necklaces and buried our people, and that we believed in the harvest and we believed in fullness, contrary to what we see, where we are actually, just these horrible images of massacre and rape and plunder, that there is also this great human quality of honoring and of beautifying the most ordinary things, which I think is worth singing about.
Talking about that, I think for me, the poem that symbolizes this best is Living Through the Apocalypse. And I think, some of those
Mhm.
images that the man jumping on the corpse of another man is doing so to save his life, that the red hole in the dead man's chest is a rare kind of flower which blooms only when the body turns to dust. I mean, these contradictions
Mhm.
that, we don't see something for what it actually is. It is
Mm.
actually a terrible horror unfolding, or we're blind to it on purpose. Perhaps there's a terrible horror unfolding in front of us, but we choose to see it as something else. I think for me that's such a powerful poem.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the question of living in this post-truth,
Yeah,
moment. The idea of what is real, what is the truth, the fake news, the AI, the loom of all of this is very much threatening a kind of foundation of basic fact. And I think as a journalist, you can appreciate that, this is a
absolutely.
sort of endangered, you are the endangered species now.
Because
Um,
I mean, we grew up being told that if you have to check whether something is right or wrong, you have to just see it for what it is. Look out, whether it's raining or not, you have to just look out of your window. But now,
yes.
even if it's raining, we're told no, no, it's not because we
Well, if
told you
somebody
so.
says it, and so that's the other thing is also you get into a really strange place where not just that photos or voices or anything can be manipulated to make it seem, But even if something is happening, if a person in power can just say, no, it's not happening,
It's not
it's
happening.
not like that, then it's
Yeah,
not happening. So then
exactly.
what do you do? And I
Yeah,
think that's the real danger, and that's the real fear. And that's where I suppose the question of then what does one say to that? How do you respond, and how do you arrive at anything when we are living in that dynamic, you know?
exactly. When the most powerful people who control, the institutions that are meant to shape you are telling you that no, 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 you're wrong. This is not what's happening. Let me
Yeah,
tell you.
yeah,
As the Economist
yeah.
wrote recently, we're a republic of uncles. Let me explain to you. that that is
Yeah,
everyone's favorite
yes.
phrase. The other thing that struck me was the beautiful watercolors, which are in black and white. Talk a little about
Mm.
them. They're so gorgeous. Who's done them? Is that you?
No, no. So these are by a wonderful artist, Veer Mishra, who also designed the cover of the book, and these are his artworks inside. And
Beautiful.
when I was talking with Dharini, my editor, Dharini Bhaskar at HarperCollins, and she said, would you consider? I said, let me look at them, and I love. I really think of all the forms, poetry is the most elastic, the most porous and available to work with other forms. So I do, poetry and music and dance and film. And so the visual aspect is very, very strong in poetry. And so it made complete sense to me when I saw them that we could incorporate it into the book, and that it would really add a kind of texture, I suppose. So yeah, I'm very happy to have them in this edition.
Especially this one. I just love it. There's something so sad about it.
Yeah, yeah.
Someone said when children die, they become birds in heaven. And really, you look at that child running towards what? I don't know, just his own or her own destruction. It's
Yeah,
such
yeah.
a powerful image.
Yes, it is. And I like that they are these kind of there's a wash to them. There's
Yeah.
not they kind of have this cloudy feeling, which really suits for me my emotions, I suppose, and a lot of these poems that even though they are aiming to arrive at some kind of emotional clarity, is really moving through this morass of uh, having to live with a great deal of uncertainty. And I think that is a again from COVID, this is the sort of thing that we all have to do is we have to be able to live with uncertainty, and it's very difficult. We cannot be certain about anything, and perhaps there is beauty to be had in some forms of uncertainty, I guess. And certainly these watercolors, they make me feel that it is possible.
It's so lovely. I really do recommend this to everyone. It's both timely and timeless, which is a very rare quality in any work of art. So, thank you so much, Tishani. I do hope we meet sometime soon. It was such a pleasure to read this and such a pleasure to
Thank
talk to
you.
you as well. Thank you so
Thank
much for
you,
your
Prabha.
time.
Thank you.